here we go with another 20 minutes of The Hobbit. And for those of you that like to know, we're about this far into the book. This far we have to go. And we just began chapter 6, called Out of the Frying Pan into the Fire. And I finished up on page 97. Bilbo has made it out of the mountain, past Gollum, past the dwarves. He's now discovered that the ring has some special qualities, which is helping him right now. And he's stumbled upon the dwarves who have also gotten themselves out. But he thinks to himself, okay, now I'm going to let them in on the surprise. I see them. They can't see me. I'm just going to show up. So I'm on the top of page 97. And it says, I will give them all a surprise, he thought, as he crawled into the bushes at the edge of the dell. Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels, and wondering and debating what they were to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying that they could not possibly go on with their journey, leaving Mr. Baggins in the hands of the goblins, without trying to find out if he was alive or dead, and without trying to rescue him. After all, he is my friend, said the wizard, and not a bad little chap. Gotta resituate myself. Comfortable in the chair. I wish to goodness you had not lost him. And you know what, that I had issue with, because that was someone, Gandalf was there with them. They were all in the same situation. So why is it that the dwarves lost him? Okay. The dwarves wanted to know why he had ever been brought at all. Why he could not stick with his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense. He has been more trouble than use so far, said one. If we have got to go back now into those abominable tunnels to look for him, then drat him, I say. Gandalf answered angrily, I brought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. Either you help me look for him, or I go and leave you here to get out of the mess as best you can yourselves. If we can only find him again, then you will thank me before all is over. Whatever did you want to go and drop him for, Dory? You would have dropped him, said Dory, if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your leg from behind in the dark, tripped up your feet, and kicked you in the back. Then why didn't you pick him up again? Good heavens, can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark, everybody falling over bodies and hitting one another? You nearly chopped off my head with Glamdring, and Thorin was stabbing here and there and everywhere with Orcrist. All of a sudden, you gave one of your blinding flashes, and we saw the goblins running back yelping. You shouted, follow me, everybody, and everybody ought to have followed. We thought everybody had. There was no time to count, and you know quite well, till we had dashed through the gate guards, out of the lower door, and helter-skelter down here, and here we are, without the burglar, confusegate him. So, quite often, when things get tense, everybody gets mad and everybody plays the blame game. So that's what's happening here. Everybody's blaming, you should have done this and you should have done that. And it's really a disheartening feeling. Plus, Bilbo is listening to all of this. And if it was you or I listening to people discuss how useless you are or how useful you were, you know, it would put a thought in my head as well, too. I know we've often been stuck in jobs or situations where we want to be useful and we don't feel, either we feel like a fraud or we feel like we're not useful, but we're trying our absolute very best. Okay. So, and here's the burglar, said Bilbo, stepping down into the middle of them and slipping off the ring. Bless me, how they jumped. Then they shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was as astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all the others. He called to Balin and told him what he thought of a lookout man who let people walk right into them like that without warning. It is a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a very great deal with the dwarves after this. If they had still doubted that he was really a first-class burglar, in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer. Balin was the most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. So they don't know that he has the ring. He has suddenly shown up in their midst and seemed to have slipped past them, and they couldn't see him. And so this adds credibility to his role as a burglar. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he just chuckled inside and said nothing whatever about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, just crept along, very carefully and quietly." Well, it is the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose, and not been spotted, said Balin. "And I take off my hood to you," which he did. "Balin, at your service," said he. "Your servant, Mr. Baggins," said Bilbo. Then they wanted to know all about his adventures after they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything, except about the finding of the ring. Not just now, he thought. Have we ever wondered about withholding a piece of information that would have changed our credibility or persona in someone's eyes? They were particularly interested in the riddle competition and shuddered most appreciatively at his description of Gollum. And then I couldn't think of any other question with him sitting beside me, ended Bilbo. So I said, "What's in my pocket?" And he couldn't guess in 3 goes. So I said, "What about your promise? Show me the way out." But he came at me to kill me, and I ran and fell over, and he missed me in the dark. Then I followed him because I heard him talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, and so he was making for it. And then he sat down in the entrance, and I could not get by. So I jumped over him and escaped and ran down to the gate. "What about guards?" they asked. "Weren't there any?" "Oh, yes, lots of them. But I dodged them. I got stuck in the door, which was only open a crack, and I lost lots of buttons," he said sadly, looking at his torn clothes. "But I squeezed through all right, and here I am." The dwarves looked at him with quite a new respect when he talked about dodging guards, jumping over Gollum, and squeezing through, as if it was not very difficult or very alarming. "What did I tell you?" said Gandalf, laughing. "Mr. Baggins has more about him than you guess." He gave Bilbo a queer look from under his bushy eyebrows as he said this, and the hobbit wondered if he guessed at the part of his tale that he had left out. Then he had questions of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all by now to the dwarves, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again, and where they had all got to now. The wizard, to tell the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once. So now he had told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins in that part of the mountains, but their main gate used to come out on a different pass, one more easy to travel by, so that they often caught people benighted near their gates. Evidently, people had given up going that way, and the goblins must have opened their new entrance at the top of the pass the dwarves had taken quite recently, because it had been found quite safe up to now. I must see if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again, said Gandalf, or soon there will be no getting over the mountains at all. As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. In the flash which killed the goblins that were grabbing him, he had nipped inside the crack just as it snapped to. So it closed up. He followed after the drivers and prisoners right to the edge of the great hall, and there he sat down and worked up the best magic he could in the shadows. A very ticklish business it was, he said, touch and go. But of course, Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments with fire and lights. Even the Hobbit had never forgotten the magic fireworks at Old Took's Midsummer Eve parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew all about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate, where Bilbo lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with this part of the mountains. But it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them in the right direction. They made that gate ages ago, he said, partly for a way of escape if they needed one, partly as a way out into the lands beyond, where they still come in the dark and do great damage. They guard it always, and no one has ever managed to block it up. They will guard it doubly after this, he said. All the others laughed too. After all, they had lost a good deal, but they had killed the great goblin and a great many others besides, and they had all escaped, so they might have said to have had the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses. We must be getting on at once. Now we are a little rested, he said. They will be out after us in hundreds when night comes on, and already shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we have passed. We must be miles on before dusk. There will be a bit of moon if it keeps fine, and that is lucky. Not that they mind the moon much, but it will give us a little light to steer by. Oh yes, he said in answer to more questions from the Hobbit. You lose track of time inside goblin tunnels. Today's Thursday, and it was Monday night or Tuesday morning that we were captured. We have gone miles and miles and come right down through the heart of the mountains, and are now on the other side. Quite a shortcut. But we are not at the point to which our pass would have brought us. We are too far to the north and have some awkward country ahead, and we are still pretty high up. Let's get on. So I'm at the top of page 101. We felt that there was time passing, but Bilbo was in the dark. He was solving riddles with Gandalf. He was solving riddles with Gollum. And when you're in a survival situation, you're not really concerned about time. You're concerned about surviving minute to minute. Okay, so I'm in the top of page 101, and it says, I am so dreadfully hungry, groaned Bilbo, who was suddenly aware that he had not had a meal since the night before last. Just think of that for a hobbit. His stomach felt all empty and loose, and his legs all wobbly, now that the excitement was over. Can't help it, said Gandalf, unless you like to go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your pony back and your luggage. No, thank you, said Bilbo. Very well, then. We must just tighten our belts and trudge on, or we shall be made into supper, and that will be much worse than having none ourselves. As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat. But the blackberries were still only in flower, and of course there were no nuts or even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a bit of sorrel, and he drank from a small mountain stream that crossed the path. and he ate 3 wild strawberries that he found on its bank, but it was not much good. They still went on and on. The rough path disappeared. The bushes and the long grass